Great, so we're very lucky here today to have this fantastic panel. I mean, just hundreds of credits and film history sitting here. We're going to try to circumscribe a little bit what we're going to talk about, but we're talking about a very broad topic, which is color, and color science, and color art, and color psychology. And we've got a lot to get to. I'll try to direct it as well as I can, but the objective for me is to speak as little as possible. I'm going to introduce you to these people, but I'm pretty sure you know most of them. But first of all, tell me, how many of you here are working filmmakers? Raise your hand, please. Quite a few.
Oh, great.
And how many are students? Okay. Great. Okay, so at my far right, Matt Tomlinson, color scientist for Harvard.
Thank you.
Elodie Ichter. Bradford Young, I think you know who he is. Yeah. Joe Gawler, a founder of Harvard and a master colorist. And perhaps you know this fellow here.
Stand, you must stand. You must stand. You must stand. You must stand. Camerimage. You must stand.
So, just to give us a little bit of context, I wanted to talk about, the evolution of the color science. And, in the old days, Ed can attest, that when it was a film, the relationship between the cinematographer and the color timer was kind of sacrosanct. And often the director was not even allowed in the room. Is that right, Ed?
We tried to.
Yeah. And you had a position of trust, and you weren't ready to show the pictures to your other collaborators until you and the color timer were ready. And that, of course, has evolved with the evolution of digital technology. And I think in the beginning, when the DI first came in, and there was this tremendous amount of control over the image after the fact, it struck fear into the hearts of cinematographers. You still needed to have the trust and the amazing control that you had over the image, and it took a little bit of working out to make that relationship work. And I think that Harvard is built around the idea of that trust, so that from the beginning of the process, from the conception of the images and the design of the images, through the cinematography on the set and through post, could be more of a unified procedure and system. And we're gonna get to that, but I think first, we should talk from the role of the conception of the images and talk about color. I know that Ed wanted to talk a little bit about the psychology of perception, what color is, what it means, and how cinematographers communicate with it. Now, I know, Ed, some cinematographers say that that the color can be a symbolic and a solid, repeatable evocation of emotion in the viewer. But you were talking earlier to me about a different way of thinking about it. Well, tell the people what you were telling me earlier, Ed.
Tell the people.
Well, you got me in trouble now. No, I was saying that, look, image or color is not empirical. That goes back to like 1810 when Goethe wrote about color and the theory of color, to Joseph Albers writing about it in the 60s, interpretation of color. So, I've heard people talk about, the moon is mother and the sun is father, and well, that's fine if they think that, but that isn't necessarily even the way they thought about color in painting. They thought about it as, how do people perceive certain colors? And it wasn't an empirical or it was more a theoretical approach, which got a lot of, at that time they were looking at color through wavelengths and trying to understand what color meant because of the wavelength of the light. And what was so revolutionary about Goethe is that he said, you can't make that distinction, but what you can do is observe color and see how it affects people's emotions. So that's why I've always tried to think about color, is how color can affect people's emotions. And, you know, just on a basic level, like warm colors advance and cool colors recede, and they have different effects against each other. And what Joseph Albers talked about was how color can change just by the representation of one color next to another, which even happens to you when you have, let's say, a green scene, and the next scene you have is a neutral scene. That neutral scene will actually look magenta because you have a retina, you have a color in your mind that you know responds to the white light, and you see it in its opposite. So those are all things we could talk about, but I'm more interested in what you said about the difference with film and digital, how you work with a director, which I'm sure most of you deal with, is there was a delay. You know, you would look at the print or the film with the work print with the director and the colorist, and then you would give them notes, and then it would be like a day delay till they made a new print, so you could discuss the color again. Well, now it becomes more problematic and difficult if you have the director immediately in the room to make the change, so you have no chance to respond to what you're doing. And you know, that's something I think we could all talk about. Is it more difficult, the process of coloring a film, because everyone feels that they have that immediate reaction to what they're looking at, and not everybody sees color or exposure the same way.
If I could just add,
Jump in, Joe, yeah.
Is this, hello, is that working? Yeah? To Ed's point, I had this interesting experience of working with Woody Allen on his first DI, Midnight in Paris, with Darius Kanji. And Darius and I did our first pass on the whole movie, and then Woody comes in to review what we had done once Darius felt we were in a good place. And we watched the entire run of the DI in complete silence. Woody sat there with his hands on his lap, and then when lights came up, this guy gave us notes from the very first shot of the movie all the way through to the end of the movie in order, and not like hemming and hawing and questioning. I had pages and pages and pages of very specific notes, and just like that discipline that Woody had from photochemically timing and not quite understanding that he was in this DI experience yet. Like, it blew our minds. Darius and I both were like, holy cow, like, how did he remember all of that stuff? That was a really cool experience.
Bradford, tell us a little bit about the differences in when you're shooting film or when you're shooting digital, how the post works, and whether that procedure has evolved to a way that you can exercise your creativity in an effective way.
Well, you can hear me?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, you can.
Oh, yeah.
Well, unfortunately, I was on. I trained on film, but I was on the back end. So by the time I got to a point where I was, working in a space where I could do photochemical timing, it was kind of not happening for us. There was this whole, this whole conversation we keep having like every 5 years, like it's over, and then Ed scoops up all the gear and says it's not over. Wait, but yeah. So unfortunately, I didn't really have a chance to do any photochemical passes on any of my films. Everything. By the time I got to features, we would shoot on film, but we were in a DI environment, which is a privilege, honestly. There's a lot to learn from there. So it's hard to have a real educated analysis about it as it responds to finishing. But I think I will say one thing about resistance and restraint, and this idea that and kind of expanding on what Ed's saying, this idea that everything works around this idea of relativity. So there's a certain thing that happens. You sharpen your senses when you're able to work in a particular format or work in a particular creative space. That thing goes away for a while, and you come back and create another relationship with it. There is a certain sharpening, there's a certain thing that happens spiritually There's certain thing that happens in the material world that is healthy, that I think we are not, we're not honoring, you know. So for instance, I shot, you know, Joe and I did Pariah together on film. We did Ain't the Body's Saints on film, and then we didn't do film we haven't done film ever. Oh no, then we did Pawn and Sacrifice a little bit, and then Elodie and I did some with Joe. We did some coloring stuff on when I was on Space Jam. But it's interesting the amount of learning and unlearning, and what that does to the creative spirit, the creative process, the amount of knowledge we gain when we're able to sort of abandon a relationship with something and revisit it. It's very healthy, you know. And so I think those things we have forgotten. That's a lost art form. It's a lost art form because we're artists. We're not just technicians. You know, we work. Our relationship to color is based on emotion and memory. You know, like I think you've heard me say before. You know, my whole perception of color is my grandmother's living room. Like that's where I know color. You know, my grandparents in Louisville, Kentucky. It was a very pastel thing. You know, they came from a certain economic environment where they were not interested in color. The same way that my grandmother in Chicago, who had her own sort of economic value, the way she was interested in color. And so, and my relationship to color is based on that. So it's very personal for me, you know, and that's a vibration that can't be expressed through science, literature, what have you. That's in the spirit. And so, I think this process of like in this process of resistance in our process is healthy. And I think, you know, we don't get a chance to meditate or think about the thing. I know Joe and I always do that. Joe and I do this thing where we just take walks, you know.
Yeah.
It's like, we're not great anymore, let's take a walk around the block and come back. Or in the middle of a scene, Joe's like, go out, step out, have a coffee and come back in. And those things, you know, I think those are the things in our process that really help us sort of, that are kind of forgotten, that I think are good for young people to have now, because I think it engages with something very ancient, but also engages with something very within a contemporary space, you know.
We can see that in your images. You know, A Most Wanted, A Most Violent Year was extraordinary, and there's a deep wisdom in those images that's coming from you, and we can feel that.
I was just saying, Ain't Them Bodies Saints was playing on TV 2 nights ago at 2 o'clock in the morning. I got back from one of the parties. I turned on the TV and Saints was playing with Polish dubbing, which yeah, it was playing here.
Oh, that's great.
Watch it in the hotel. It was cool. But I was just to add to what Brad was saying is thinking about this discussion today and you know how this would be informative to people. I was like, this is really challenging because it's so like personal and emotional, like particularly my work with Brad. You know, we just connect, and I feel that the cinematographers that have come back to me time and time again, and Ed is like, we just see things the same way, and any kind of relationship that a director or cinematographer has with a colorist, it's you know, you just want someone that has the same taste and the same kind of energy and vibe to, and like, so I'm so appreciative that I've found so many wonderful collaborators, and when we're working together, doesn't have to be a tremendous amount of conversation, because they're just like, yeah, Joe, you do your thing, you know, and at least, you know, in the beginning, and then once we get into the details later, it's just this level of trust. And then also going from the comfortable confines of a deluxe and Technicolor, which were great experiences for me, to then starting Harbor with this idea of like building this environment for filmmakers to feel at home, and the filmmakers then bring something to Harbor, just made the personal experience that much greater for me, and the responsibility I felt. So I was like so appreciative. You know, I brought Brad through Harbor when there were no walls up yet. It's like saying, hey, this is what we're doing. And so it is just such a like personal experience. And I'm sure all the cinematographers in here and colorists like know that, like they've got their guy or their woman that's like the one that gets it, you know, so that you're always going to fight for that colorist, and hopefully things work out schedule-wise and budget and all of that you can make it work.
Elodie, tell us, you know, about The Irishman, And you can pick up on any of those threads, you know, the psychology of perception of color, your relationship with Rodrigo and Yvonne Lucas on that, the fact that you were shooting film, that you were working with images that were shot film and digital and making them work together. What are your thoughts based on what the other panelists have said thus far?
I want to jump into the conversation, the relation between the DP and the colorist. And for example, with The Irishman, it was we were working with Rodrigo. I started at the lab as well, not as a color timer, but it was the beginning of the DI, but I saw how it works. And from that, I started working like a color timer. I talk about point of color. And that's the language that we have with Rodrigo. So when the more you work with the DP, the better you're going to understand his vision. And so if you speak the same language, then you don't even need to talk after that, kind of. Yeah.
And with Yvonne and Rodrigo, you know, tell us about how it worked on that particular project.
So for The Irishman, what happened is I was, from the beginning of the project, me and Yvonne and Matt, we set up the look with Rodrigo. So before the shoot, we had session to set up the look of the movie because we had 4 different looks on that project. And then I went to New York and I did the dailies for Rodrigo. So we were in constant communication every day about the look that he wanted for each scene. And then after that, when the DI happened last summer, we all 3 were working all together. So it was very, like we had 2 rooms and Rodrigo was going from one room to another to work with us. Mm-hmm. So he was doing a scene with Yvonne, then he was doing a scene with me, and then checking what Yvonne did, and then going back and forth in the room. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Matt, you know, tell us about how that process has evolved. It seems to me, you know, that it's more natural for color to be something that's considered and supported by the science throughout the project, rather than something that comes in segments. The cinematographer imagines things, you know, figures out how to achieve it, comes to a post-production, you know, then there's dailies, then there's post-production. No, it's one process. How does the science support what these people are talking about?
Well, I mean, first I'd like to take a step back because this is actually a really amazing experience for me because I get to be the nerd in the room. You know, like, and
we can't do it without the nerd.
and it's actually really cool because I love hearing this conversation of like, we're here to tell stories, and we're focusing in on, you know, color tells the story, and that drives emotion and can take us to places just as strongly as music can, or framing and these kind of things. And one of my, you know, I'm the color scientist. I'm the guy that people go, okay, well, what's the math? How can I get this look? Get me in there. And my favorite part is actually to sit with all of these people, and before things start, before makeup and hair, anything, what do you want? What do you want? Like, where are we going with this? You know, what do we want to say? Do you have reference? I really like this movie. I kind of want to pick up on this from that other movie from the 70s, or, you know, for The Irishman, Rodrigo brought books and books of reference. I want for one decade of the movie, it's this look, and on this page I like what this red is doing in the skin tones here, and another decade I like what the shadows are doing here in the skies, and then it's my job to be that kind of Rosetta Stone, that interpreter, if I can. So, you know, there's this idea of like, I'm the color scientist, I'm the super nerd, but my real job is to try to get inside your head. My job is to understand how you think. So if I can understand how the colorist thinks, and the DPs and the creatives that come on, and then hopefully as time goes on, I can get that shorthand too. And I can go, I get it. Now I'm gonna go run away to my little cubbyhole for an hour, and I'm gonna build some stuff. And I'm gonna come back, and let's take a look at it. And then the feedback starts happening, where it's like, okay, yes, I like this, but I don't like that. Okay, great. And the tools are so strong now that a lot of these, like, I can start the process, but then Joe and Elodie can keep going with it, and it becomes this interactive almost like a recording session, if you will, and they're driving things in directions in real time. No, what about this? Let's change this. Let's change that. And there are moments where like the colors, they can get so far and they're not quite getting it just because the tools are what they are. But I can have other tools. I go, okay, hold on. I see where you're going. I'm going to run away. And I go out and I'm going to come back in 10 minutes. You guys keep playing. I come back and I come with, here's 3 more options. Try this. Boom, 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 boom. And you might go, yeah, okay, I like number 2. Let's mix 50% of number 2 with 20% of number 1. And that's this decade of the show.
It's that intense.
So like I love the concept of the psychology and the art of it. Because my whole job in this whole thing, I am here to serve in this respect, and if I'm doing it really well, then maybe I'm up front. I love being up front. I love being in there with you. But then I can, there's a point where I step back, and I kind of fall into the shadows because all the technical, if I'm doing my job right, the technical setup, and then the DI. But I'm gonna pull it even back further. I'm gonna say we're in this day and age where the DI starts at the dailies. We're not just let's get out there and do some dailies and figure it out later. And let's figure it out up front. Let's like there's some ideas that we're floating here, and let's riff on that. Now we can always change our mind later on. We have that flexibility because we're smart people and we can set ourselves up to do that. But if we can get as much of this up front as we can, then the entire process becomes smoother because then the look that's rolling in the mind of what we want this to be in the end is already percolating with people and they're falling in love with it. As opposed to, let's just throw LUT on there and we'll blast through some dailies and we'll figure it out later. But if we can all just kind of encapsulate it, that's where some real magic can happen. So yeah, that's where I stand.
Great. I wanted to ask, Ed and Bradford. Pardon?
No,
Okay.
I just,
Go ahead.
well, I just want to be contrary. No, I mean, this first round is what I think we all go into the process with, but it's really the practicality of how we come out with the results. And I think that's going to be more helpful for people. And the problem is, and you're a great navigator of that, what happens when you go in the color correct with the cameraman and the director, and they have oppositional points of view, which can happen in, look, the most important thing I find to do is to get your dailies as close to what you feel the look as that you want, so they see it in the editing room. Because if they see dailies off in the editing room, invariably the director is going to say, that's the way they were in the editing room, that's what I want. So I painfully, even if I have to go in at night or early in the morning before dailies, to try to get the dailies as close to what I think the look should be. Well, what happens then when the director on the Avid starts changing the color or the density because they think that's the way it could look, or they don't like the screenings that they're testing the film at, so they try to make changes in the Avid, and they bring that to the color session. Then you're in this dilemma of saying, well, but that isn't what we did, but yeah, but that's what I want. So how does Joe, and that's why I continually go back to Joe, navigates that between the cinematographer and the director to come up with a solution to what they supposedly both want?
Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah. Not to put you on the seat.
No, I feel like I could probably go back and get my doctorate in psychology. Yeah. When you're in the room managing different expectations, that's 90% of the job. And but there's certainly hurdles, like Ed's saying, sometimes they crank up the brightness of the monitors in the edit suite, particularly on your movies. We get in there like, what is that?
Don't do that.
And then you're fighting against that in the DI, for sure. I see that on almost every movie. The cinematographer and I sit together for a couple days, hopefully, and it just kind of falls in. They're like, yeah, this is the way it should be. We're usually working in printer lights, trying to keep this kind of organic approach, because I'm not trying to like pull the image apart. We do the first 2-3 passes, contrast, red, green, and blue, and everyone's like, great, this is it. And then when the director and the editor come in, it's not what they have been looking at for a couple of months. Like, that can happen, even if the dailies are great. They jack up the brightness on the monitor, and so there is always this process of them getting them kind of reacclimated to what the cinematographer's intention was. Because I always think it's interesting that the DP's coming in and they haven't been watching it every day for 8 months like the director and the editor have. And that's why, like at Harbor, we have a lot of editing suites at Harbor, so a lot of shows are cutting there, and so I'm able to communicate with the editor and the director. I'm talking to them for months, and they may just route their Avid into my DI theater, and we can watch rough cuts and stuff like that and get the conversation going earlier, so hopefully you can kind of pull them into what the aesthetic might be months or weeks ahead of the final DI. But yeah, I mean, to what Ed's saying, that's definitely, that temp love is always an issue. And I think it was a bigger issue even on film with Rec 709 dailies and stuff like that. Like now, everyone's seeing the LUT. I'll build a custom show LUT for Brad or for Ed, and that's on the monitor on set, and so like at least everyone is seeing the intent earlier on. So I think it has actually gotten better than telecine dailies. They'd show you something on their laptop in Rec 709 that maybe had some weird gamma, and you'd be looking at your P3 display up on the screen, and they just you couldn't get them to match necessarily because the intent that they had from their rough cut was never that wasn't what was intended by the cinematographer.
Mm-hmm. Elodie?
Yeah, I just wanted to add for the Irishman, that's what happened when we really wanted to have the dailies to be as perfect as we could, and the DI started at the dailies. The whole environment was controlled of where they were seeing the dailies. Rodrigo had a monitor that was exactly the same that I was working on. The director had the same monitor that Matt calibrated, so everyone would see the same image. And so when we started the DI, everything from the dailies transferred to the DI, and we started from that, and then we upgraded the image. But and I can tell you, like every single session that we had with the director, there was that question, like, can I see the dailies? So we compared all the time to the dailies because that's what they are familiar with. So it was very important to start from the dailies to have the look of the movie already.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, it's a fight.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
Just to add to that, in relation specifically to that question, in relation to the Irishman, when Elodie was saying that the DI actually started in dailies, that includes, the dailies were not CDL based. We were actually using the tools of the actual, that fully tool set of the DI. So one could say that the DI actually began and actually transferred into the VFX world and transferred into the DI. So it all rolled together. And that concept of, looking at a display and then you look at another display and it's not working right. We're at that stage now where hopefully we're not really having that conversation as much, because if we're doing our jobs right, we're mapping these shows into the proper displays, we're controlling those environments, and then the people who have the critical eye are seeing things as they should be intended to be seen. So, it's this concept of from the beginning, even before daily start, being the shepherd of the show all the way through from the beginning to the end, so that creative intent, which is all pinnacle, is maintained. So hopefully you have as few conversations of this isn't where I wanted to go as possible. Now the human factor of we changed our minds, I now want to go in this other direction, is always viable, and it's always maneuverable. And that's kind of where we stand. I am water, I flow. So we can do all that.
Mm-hmm.
Bradford, any thoughts along those lines about intent and how to navigate that difficult period where the director and the editor are looking at these images for a long time and getting used to something that's a little different from what you had intended?
Yeah, well, I was having a lot of thoughts as everybody was speaking. And this isn't the way that it happens. I'm gonna say this not with the assumption that this is the way it's going to always happen, but because we are still lumpy proletariats, like we gotta go get work and take care of our families and stuff. But so we can't always do what I'm proposing, which is this is why I think fundamentally, and I think this addresses a lot of issues fundamentally. This is the reason why community building is important, right? We work in an art form that's very, very collaborative. And in that collaboration, we have to manage a lot of personalities. And I think the reason why I'm advocating for community building is because what it does is that it gives community building, collective building, whatever you want to call it, it gives everybody a sense of ownership of the thing that they do. And what people in the collective or what people in the community have to do is that we all agree that that individual or that person is the expert or the most knowledgeable person around this thing, right? So, but what happens in film is because it's driven so hard by capitalism, it doesn't allow us, the concept of collective, positioning or community building is kind of a dead concept. We don't have communes anymore. We don't do stuff together anymore. We jump from job to job. If you're that cinematographer that gets to work with the same director over and over again, that's a blessing, right? So this whole idea of for me, I think one of the remedies is building community, building a collective consciousness around what it is we're doing, and I think when we can do that, yes, we will not always agree. Yes, we will evolve. Listen, I evolved from the time I start the film until the time that I'm done with the film. Joe can tell you, by the time I'm done with the film, I kind of don't want to be in the DI because I've done all the hard work on the days, right? And my thing now is, don't have to talk to me, talk to Zach or Joe. You know what I mean? They are an extension of what we built from the jump, and the director gave us the literature. So every image that's created on screen comes from the story, right? So these cats that are involved in the process of coloring your image have been inoculated with your story because I gave them the shot, and they are carriers of the story. So it's this whole idea that what we want is different from what the director wants is not acceptable knowledge. I don't accept that, and the reason why I don't accept that, but I don't accept that, but the reason I can accept that is because we're not building community. And I'm only pushing this idea of building community because when I look out in the audience, there are a lot of young faces, and I see a lot of people who I know are trying to make film make sense in the 21st century reality. And I think this conundrum of Joe and I have done, I'll just share it with, very transparent. Joe and I have done 3 films where it's just I'm already assuming because we didn't build community or the community fell apart in the process, I probably should not come to the DI because I'm going to be an emotional factor in the room that might not render the image in the way that it should be. I can accept that. So maybe Joe and the director should be together in the room. And honestly, it's no loss. You know what I'm saying? It's no loss, right? Because if you're building community, everybody says, yeah, you're emotional. You can't handle this right now because you've put so much into it. Let me sit with this person, Joe, who happens to be, in the community building context, the most psychologically stable, the most logical, the person, no, really, you know what I mean? That person that has their finger on the balance of the art and the science, right? And I would love to hear Ed build on this, but hasn't the color timer, hasn't the colorist always been sort of the psychologist anyway, right? Because they're the person that brings the final iteration, the final synthesis in this dialectics of making film. They're the final missing link. And so we should let that person own that, right? We should let that person be entitled with that title, be entitled with that sense of empowerment, and let them bring, for me, which is blessing of working with Joe is, for me, it's the whole idea of not even talking about the image anymore. This whole idea, Joe and I don't even have to talk anymore. For me, I'm just excited because I know Joe works with a lot of folks that I admire, you know what I mean? And Joe works with a lot of cats that I don't know who he's learned a lot from. And so for me, I'm benefiting from Joe's knowledge of working with the previous cinematographer, the previous director. So let Joe do his thing. We're going to find it. And if it's not right, either instinctually he'll know it's not right based on the story, or we'll tell him it's not right. But I think, this idea of collective building, community building is really important because it sort of puts the control back into the hands. Because, cinematography, we can advocate for ourselves in really rigid ways, but I don't think that is going to settle the issue. I think what's going to settle the issue is when we decide we're doing this together, and before we even talk about how we're going to tackle this film visually, let's talk about how we're going to tackle this film psychologically, like how are we going to tackle this film as a community. And I'll just say this one last thing and I'm done. This other thing I was thinking about too, this idea of language, right? This keeps coming up. Visual language, the language of color, right? The language of color science.
Arrival was about language.
Arrival's about this whole idea of like language for me is also important because, I'm an institutionalized filmmaker. Like I went to film school, so my language around filmmaking is colonized. Like I'm using the same language that filmmakers have been using for 100 years, but I don't owe anybody any of that. I don't owe anybody any of that. What I owe is my own. I owe myself to create my own grammar, my own language, which is very specific. Like I'm from Louisville, Kentucky. That's not the same language that Ed's gonna have. You know what I mean? We're very different, but you have to create the language because the language is what ultimately, at the end of the day, is what propels what I think is the collective consciousness around. How we're going to move through this process, and it's important for people to know and understand and speak the language so that we understand that we're all working towards the same thing.
If I could expand on that too, is
Go ahead, Joe.
My relationship with Brad. He comes in and he's like, "It's yours now, Joe. Like I already did my thing. Now, like I give it to you, and that like responsibility is crazy." He's like, "I'm gonna, and go take care of some things. I'll be back at the end of the day." But like he really gives me that space and that time to interpret the images myself, and so I'm just like, it's like, fuck man, it's like, what am I gonna do? This is a huge responsibility, but I so appreciate that trust. And then to what Brad's point about just like us being in this business and the community, that's what Harbor's all about, the community. And if I'm doing some kind of studio project that's like a romantic comedy or something that has its own aesthetic and its own, look and responsibility, you have to adapt and do that. And that's a fantastic thing. But then I feel like I'm grounded again when I'm doing a Jim Jarmusch project and like the relationship I have with Jim or with Ed and Todd and with Bradford, like that's the roots for me, and so it's I feel so grateful that I can kind of like go in and out of those worlds, like doing certain projects that with the commercial appeal and everything of them, and that's all great. And then being in New York, like I'm so glad I stayed as a New York colorist, and to have like the filmmakers that come to New York, that really to me like that's my aesthetic. Like I'm really grounded in what Ed does and Brad does, and certainly everything with Jim, like that's what I'm all about.
Well, I would like to say that I wish I could be half as eloquent as Bradford. He just blew in 8 hours from Baltimore. He hasn't slept or anything. He's here. He's laying it on. It's beautiful. And I would, one of the things that I thought of as you were talking, Bradford and Joe, was that we're hoping to build this community as part of what Camerimage is about. We're all here together. Maybe we should try to do this more often than once a year, and I think that, part of building that community is having that common language, and part of having that common language is the film history. And another thing that, Joe brings is this deep knowledge of the film history, partly because of all of the work you've done with Criterion. And I know that Ed has helped you on some of that. Let's talk about that and the history and the color and how it supports what you do and what we all do today.
Yeah, that's another tremendous responsibility. So I started off as a commercial colorist, Michelle Suissa here got me started really doing commercials and stuff in New York back in the day. And then I got introduced to the Criterion Collection. They brought me Solaris, you know, and it's like, yeah, getting started with such a film like that. But, you know, working off an IP and working with these amazing filmmakers, all of a sudden, you know, I go from being this 30-second spot guy to sitting with, you know, Robert Altman or, you know, Tak Fujimoto and Jonathan Demme and all these people. And I was like, now this is cool. Like, I really am enjoying that. And, you know, and Wes Anderson actually, you know, doing a Bottle Rocket with him. And so developing your eye off of working on these kind of photochemically timed films really, like, just keeps my head, I feel like, in the right space when it comes to even doing DIs today.
Ed, do you want to talk a little bit about the Douglas Sirk films or working with Joe, or do you have any comments about what Bradford said?
I liked what Bradford said, but I think it has to be based on respect. And so the communal idea has to be that there's a respect amongst each other for it to work. So when it breaks down is when there isn't respect.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously working with Joe, even in the last film I did with him, it was very interesting because he was a mediator in a certain sense, to the point was, well, let Joe do a pass and then we'll see. So I gave Joe my notes on the side, and he did his pass, and then everything was perfect. But if I hadn't done that, if I had fought that, I would have been in problems. So you're right, Bradford, about sometimes the hardest part is to step back and let things take their natural course, but sometimes you have to influence those things. Or at least that's been always my process. When I said this the other day, when I was younger, I had to figure out how to do things my way. And as I got older, I learned I could do them differently. I didn't have to do them my way, but I could figure out a way to do it a different way through someone else's vision. And but you still have to, like, when you put up, you know, it's the Zen idea. If you put up one fist next to another, there's a fight. If you release it, you have the chance of going further. Now, the criterion, this is always interesting. You know, people that are archivists, they're in a whole thing about, like, that you can't alter their image, you know, so what means would they have had that you have that's different? Let's say windows. So when I did like Written on the Wind and not Far From Heaven, All That Heaven Allows.
Yeah.
You know, I looked at that, and there was really a lot of inconsistencies. You know, they shot those films in a backlot 18 days, and I'm sure they timed those films in like less than a week, and probably they didn't even have Russell Meddy or come in and time it. So when I looked at it, of course, I relinquished and did the things that I thought would make the film look better, because in my mind, I said, well, if Russell Meddy was here, he would have done those things. So I did alter it, but I altered it in a way that I felt was in keeping with what the look of the film was.
Those Douglas Sirk films were crazy too. Ed and I were going through them, and it's like, wow, there's a lamp with like a purple light bulb inside of it, and there's like some big shot of like pink light across a wall with the hard shadow. It was like, it's just so cool to like go back to those movies as a colorist and get, you know, sink your teeth into them, and the, you know, you absorb kind of that influence. Those were a lot of fun to go back to. And then we also did Virgin Suicides and True Stories, and also just like a fantastic treat. And now so Ed shot those films, so we did have more opportunity to kind of play with some of the DI tools, because, you know, these were his images to kind of do as he pleased with.
Oh, correct.
Yeah, I think that another question that comes up with this tremendous control that comes along with the DI is, how much is too much? I find that with digital art, often the question is, when do you stop? And I think for a while there were a lot of films. I talked to cinematographers who, observing films and saying that maybe they're over manipulated, and part of that I think was the technology. We've gotten better, I feel, at hiding that, but we've also gotten better at the choices, right? When is something over manipulated? When is it too perfect, Joe? That's something we were talking about earlier.
I'll never be accused of having my work too perfect, and on purpose. We don't overwork the negative. Certainly the first couple of passes, setting that tone. Again, we said like printer lights, or try to keep it organic. The lighting, the exposure, everything, the production, the effort that they put in. Like it's already there in the negative. So this kind of pulling the shadows this way and pulling the highlights that way. I try to avoid that in the beginning. And then to your point, movies are so just technically proficient now that they somehow, to some degree, they kind of all look the same, and it's nice. Like Brad and I like to kind of beat it up a little bit, not by like making it more perfect, but like how do we just make it feel a little more alive, maybe a little less perfect, So things need to cut, but maybe the look on this shot isn't a literal match with the next shot, but hey, this looks better and that looks better, and it flows, and kind of that approach, I think, is helping the projects that we do together have like a little bit of life, a little bit of kind of organic, feel to them, rather than keying and separating every little element, and the type of projects that we do together, I think, allow for that aesthetic. Brad's already got a body of work. Like, people have a certain sense of like what it should look like, and we don't do that by pulling the image apart with all of these tools.
Yeah, but one thing I'll say about the whole overworked image, I kind of don't. I think that's not. I don't know. How should I say this? I don't. That for me is that I don't know if that exists. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know if that's a real thing to me. I think we all see light, shadow, color, contrast differently. You know what I mean? And what I do know is that there's several things that happen. There's like, you're in the room, and because I'm a lover, like obsessed with hip hop. So for me, sampling and appropriating things is a really important gesture to paying homage. There are many layers to that. I know it's very complicated, but there's either several things happening, and I say that to say that there's several things happening. People are either in the room and then they are trying to pay homage or appropriate or think about things that they've seen that they really love and they really want to, especially when you're young, especially when you're just trying to formulate identity, which is really what I really want to get to, which you do things that are that you feel like are getting you closer to understanding your truth as an image maker. And because you might not be at that point in your process where you can talk about how hard it is to unpack your own personal story. Let's say when you take a 14th century Dutch painting and you cut it in half and you look at it microscopically from the side, like everybody's black is different, right? You can see that in the black that they made because they had to make the color black. You can see everybody's black is different because of their preference. Like, that meta inside of it is a truth that only that person. That's a lot. It requires a lot of hard work. But if it's a milkier black versus a black that's more red versus more blue, working that for me is like, that's the interesting part. So I think the process is like, we get in the room and we're paying homage. We're trying to figure out when we can declare that meta inside of our black or that meta inside of our red, which is why color science is so interesting now, is because I can give you a photograph of my grandmother, I can give you a photograph of an ancestor and say, I need the skin tone to look like this in these scenes. Like, that's incredible control, right? But according to popular knowledge, I may be like overworking the image, but what I'm saying is that what I feel like is just getting us closer to what we really want this thing to do for us, which is cinematographers. I would love to hear Ed talk about it, or Mr. Pope. Like cinematographers, we don't get the experience always as actors do of reaching that moment of euphoria on set. We're working, right? We're working. We're just trying to make the shot happen, get the day, da 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 da. And every now and then, you feel like John Coltrane, and you're like, I've played that note, and now I'm in ascension, right? Every now and then, right? But it requires, in order for you to get to that point, it requires a certain exploration of like the small gestures. Like, I like what Tarkovsky's about. I like what Haile Garima's about. I like what Ed Lachman's about. You know what I mean? I like what Betsy Sarr is about. Like you appropriate those things, right? And those things kind of render themselves in the DI suite. I'm just using it because of digital technology. I think it's a really interesting way of putting it. Digital technology allows us to like fool around with that. That's before we start running. And then when we're ready to run, and because we've appropriated all of these things, we're ready to run. Like we lean the image far, far, far to the left. So the contrast compared to whomever, it's not their gesture, but this is my gesture. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And yeah, the highlights are explosive, but this is my gesture. I do truly believe that 99.9% of us are trying to reach that point as an image maker where we're having that conversation with something that is deeply, deeply personal, that's really hard to express to even the colorist or the director or even your parents or your family, right? We're trying to reach that thing that's really deep. So for me, this whole idea of overworking image doesn't really exist, because who am I to say it's overworked? Overworked based on what? IRE scales? Overworked based on what? Quality control by an institution that has to meet its own parameters? That's not my quality, you know? Mm-hmm. So I think these are things that, I think are the conundrum of the contemporary environment which you're making film, where, whatever you gotta do to get to that point where maybe you shed a tear, or maybe uncontrollable laughter, or maybe you go home and make love to your partner differently, or whatever it is, like whatever you need to do to get to that. I think that's what this moment has given us the privilege of doing. Listen, I'm taught by filmmakers that literally used to have their negative hostage in the lab because they couldn't afford to get their negative out. Forget the technical difficulties of bending an image one way or the other. They couldn't even get their negative out. Mm-hmm. The LA Rebellion filmmakers couldn't even make their film. To Sleep with Anger and Killer of Sheep was sitting in the lab for like 10, you know what I mean? Like it had to be excavated in order for us to see the film. Mm-hmm. So for me, it's like, these are all these baby steps that get us to, what I think is really important now about this time is that we can really get down to the super, the meta of it, that is beyond the quality control of it.
Super. Can I jump in on that from a slightly different perspective? But I'm gonna roll right in that. The idea of overworking an image. My from a color scientist, probably a very odd thing to ask, but like, is Picasso overworking an image? No. Is Monet overworking an image? These are just different images, and these are different artists. And I think we are now in this day and age where it's super exciting because there are so many tools to tell the story from a color aspect, from exactly, do I want reds in my blacks? Do I want blacks, neutral blacks, blue blacks? Do I want blacks that were emulating a 70 millimeter print from 1972? These are the questions we get to ask. We get to say things like, you know what? I want Fuji Hycon highlights, but I want Vision from 1983 in my skin tones. But at the bottom, I like nice, clean blacks. Mm-hmm. We're never in a time where we're able to have that much control over what we're actually saying. And here's the super incredibly part that, that just I live for, is that the last thing that I ever want to say to one filmmaker is, let's make your movie look exactly like that other person's movie. No, like your movie should be absolutely unique. This should be telling the story that you're telling, and it should have the qualities that are unique to this story, to this movie. So let's create that. And because it is, yes, it is a crime that film is not with us as it was 20 years ago. But we do have a lot of knowledge from that. We do have a lot of expertise and a lot of reference that we can pick up on. But here's the beautiful thing about it is that when I started in this DI world in the early 2000s, the question was not what do you want your movie to look like. It was, do you want it to be on Vision stock or Fuji stock? And it was about emulating those. And the tools were they were still extremely robust in comparison to just printer lights, which is what was available 20 years previously to that. But we're just expanding. Now, you're getting into this moral conversation of not only, it's the Jurassic Park, it's not a can we, it's should we. And the answer really from a science kind of perspective is it doesn't matter. Because if it can, somebody's doing it. Right. Morally, that's up to you. Theologically, does it work with the story you're trying to tell? Well, if it does, let's go for it. And this is the craziest thing that I've learned once I started working with people like Bradford and going into Harvard and some of the shows that I've been working on. I was raised with the idea of mathematical perfection. There was a line that one of my mentors would use where everything's perfect when everything's right, it's a straight line. And that is super true because that's when you allow yourself, you don't get into problems. You don't run into issues of, oh my God, my image just broke when I'm trying to go this route. But what the beauty of being up here with this panel is every person who's sitting here is a master of their domain. And when you're a master of your domain, that means, and what you're hitting upon, the point that you're hitting on is, are you following the rules? And if you know the rules, you know how to break the rules. And you know how to ride that razor's edge to get to where you want to go, but be where you should be. So I've really come to this concept within the past year and a half, I would say, of as an imaging scientist, as a color scientist, embracing imperfection because we can. And if you know the rules, if you know what the boundaries that you can hit, you can get right up there. And when you get up right into the ether of it all, that's where some exciting things can happen. And that's this concept of community and collaboration. I'm such a huge fan of it because together we may go to places that individually we never would have thought of. Discussions with any one of you will lead me to go, oh my God, I've never thought of that before. I'm going to go sit down with Excel and I'm going to try to write out some equations to try to get this to work. And that's part of the process. And that's what I just find it is very exciting in our time. And just, with a lot of young filmmakers out here, there's a lot of, it's hard, but there's a lot of opportunities as well. I went to film school, just like you. I came into film school and I learned on film, but I came into the industry within the digital revolution. Things like YouTube didn't exist for me. There's a lot of opportunity in those kind of realms, a lot of places to explore. So, I think this concept of, are we over-processing things? I think a lot of it is based on exploration. And if we can have these conversations of where we want to explore to, perhaps it can be a little bit more controlled. But the idea of we're here to play, I think that's what drives me.
Well, when I look at an image from Bradford or Dick Pope, what I'm interested in is the personal experience that they're having with the image. So maybe that's my analog head, but it's not something you can create in post. You can't put scratches in and say that works, or you put dust in or on the frame line or a hair. You would never reproduce the immediacy of a William Eggleston image or a Robert Frank image because he misfocused, and the misfocus in that image says everything about that image. So that's why I'm against what we think we can do in post, because it loses the authenticity of what the image represents in the moment.
Elodie, your thoughts? Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I would say for when we work with Rodrigo and we set up the look, so we have four different looks, and we talked about the Kodak room, and we had books, and we had this idea also that what is the Kodak room, and what he had in mind was maybe different than someone else, and so we, based on what he was saying to us, we created the look that he had in mind for the Kodak room. It might not be the same for you, it might not be the same for you. So it's very personal things that you create with the relation with the DP when you start building those looks and using the technology that we have today to recreate that. Also, it's what you feel, it's what your memory brings to you, and that by itself is open to anything and changes with times. So
Great.
I would agree even to Ed's point, as a colorist, you've got to adapt to every new project and every new filmmaker, and understand kind of how far they want to take it in the DI or not, or the tools that they might want to use. Like, I feel like when Ed and I are working together, we are pushing the image, like some intent, certainly with color balance and stuff like that. It's an impressionistic kind of image, and it's so much fun. But we're not using the kind of tools to really pull it apart into windowing faces and popping out eyeballs and things like that. Like, we don't get into that, but we are still very much pushing a look into the images, and so as a colorist, like, that's kind of the first thing I have to understand when I'm working with filmmakers for the first time, is kind of what their goals are, and how much of my kind of interpretation they're interested in, versus like, oh, okay, I'm pushing buttons for this person for the next 2 weeks, and that's fine too, because they know what they want, and so, like, as a colorist, you're constantly having to pivot and adapt to every new project. But I also just appreciate then the ones that I collaborate with time and time again, because I know going into it what I'm getting into, which is such a pleasure.
Great. We've got about a half hour left, so let's open it up to questions. Do we have a microphone for the crowd? I don't know if we do or not.
I can.
Okay. Oh, thanks, Gabby. Ashley has a question right here in row 2. Yeah.
G'day. This is a question for Bradford and Joe. So I've read a few interviews of you as Bradford, where you spoke about how integral your relationship with Joe is in creating your look, and considering you work so much in the shadows, I'm wondering if you can speak to how you work together in order to be able to, essentially work in those shadows together.
Mm-hmm. Go, Joe.
He has a secret, I can tell.
Because our mantra is always, well, what would Harris do? That gets said over and over in the DI theater. It's like, what would Harris Savides think about this? Because that's just such a huge inspiration for both of us. As probably everybody here, Harris is the best. But it's also the negative that Brad gives me to work with is so fantastic and so unique.
And thin.
I was like, I was fortunate enough to do a number of projects with Harris, and it feels like Harris's negative, where, like, I hope this is what they like, because it really can't be much of anything else. But we'll construct a show for every show. Brad will shoot a bunch of tests, and we'll come up with like a certain vibe and look within the constraints of the showlet that Brad will shoot through. And when I see his offlines and they look beautiful, I'm like, wow, like, did you guys do a lot of dailies grading? And Brad's like, no, man, that's just the LUT, like, nothing else. And he's such a master, like, of just dialing everything in on set with the lighting and his exposure and everything. And it's like, it's such a pleasure then for us when we're putting the finishing touches on, he's got his hip hop and his jazz going, and it's all nuance. That's the other thing we say a lot. It's just like we are going to elevate the film, but the ways that Brad and I move it together aren't always apparent to everyone else in the room.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, I think, what's interesting was, the digital, what's funny about the digital thing is that, we have this we have this knowledge about, or I had this knowledge, or we have this shared knowledge about how do you expose an image, and most of the times I'm thinking about it in a very filmic, negative kind of way, and I'm also thinking about it in a very reactionary way, right? Like the option has been made. We've made the choice. As Ed is teaching us. We make the choice. I made the choice on the day because something happened in the room and that felt like the right thing, and I don't want to unpack that. I don't want to undo that. However imperfect that is, I don't want to undo that. And because I'm trying to use that old filmmaking, shooting film knowledge, energy, where everybody is hyper focused and there's this particular way of doing it, particular movement happening around that. We bring that when we bring that sort of knowledge to the DI, what happens is that it becomes really apparent quickly that, especially the way we work, that the digital DIs aren't really, in certain levels, which we're learning a lot, is that DIs, as a response to skin tone and shadow, we don't have tools. There are tools that don't exist that can help undo or redo things that some of the troubles we have. Like in Solo, we were in trouble, you know what I mean? Because it was that conundrum of the negative looks this way, but it's got to honor all these other things that I didn't want to be conscious of, we had to be conscious of. And then on top of that, 85% of the shot is a visual effects takeover, where ILM tried and did a wonderful job of trying to follow the photography. But when those bridges come together, because it is in that pixel, we're dealing with pixels, it is in that space. It does suspend, or it does excuse the immediacy of the thing that's so imperfect in the moment, right? Because then what we end up wanting to do is bend and manipulate the pixels to sort of make this perfect match. What we're finding is that things fall apart really quickly. So our process is literally let's say for instance, Where's Kira, which I'm sure nobody saw that film in here. Where's Kira is, it was what it was. You know what I mean? It wasn't much. We couldn't, because the danger of trying to take it one way or the other would mean that there would not be an image. You know what I mean? It would be that high level of decay that wouldn't make it a film. It wouldn't be saying, the story wouldn't be there as it was intended on the day. So for us, it's there are certain I think there's certain spaces in the image that we don't touch, because you got to nail it on the day. And that nailing it on the day has to come with a high level of intention and purpose. And a lot of what we do is revisit. For me, I consider I think about building a body of work. So I'm picking films that will allow me to continue some of the conversations I was having on the previous film with my photography, right? And so, we're just kind of chipping away at a thing and making notes. Like Joe's always saying, oh man, you wouldn't believe it. I was doing the show with Ed, and I got this modifier that did this thing to the skin tone. I'd be interested to see how it would help us on the next film, And then that's that shared knowledge, that community, right? And we see if that worked this time. Okay, so we're always addressing the same thing. It's the shadows, the milkiness in the shadows, which I love, and where skin tone is down in that zone where it kind of falls apart, and how can we make that more filmic, and how can that be a higher manifestation of what was intended on the day when I was actually doing the photography,
Michael? So you guys referenced a few times building a community, and I think some of it was in reference to how you build that community on projects, on various projects. The question I ask is, what do you think about building that community outside of the project? What would you like to see happen in this industry to kind of continue to build those communities where they're not specifically tied to a project, so you can have that information sharing that you're doing, but you're doing it project to project, which is it's kind of siloed within your community and not the broader community. So I guess the question for any one of you is, how would you like to see that community building happening?
Well,
Yeah, you touched that one.
well, I think I'm only gonna touch on it a little bit because it's like Ed and I need to have a panel with y'all about this one. But
I'd love to set that panel.
I think the one thing that is this is not necessarily connected to image making, but I think it's connected to like the greater reaction to what seems to be an anti-community building model as a response to filmmaking, which I feel really intensely, is that people aren't investing in talent. People don't invest in talent. Talent, Mr. Lachman. Talent. People are not investing in talent. And what I mean by that is, there's already a formula, right? You and your friends in the community, y'all go out and make a film with the film camera that you borrowed from your friend, right? And you didn't ask nobody for no money, but you got your parents' credit, whatever. You know the process. You go make the film, and then it goes to Sundance, and then it wins an award, and then they put a crown on you, and then they say, that's my artist. But they ain't doing any of the hard work to get you there. They claim all your spirit, all your energy, all your community spirit around making it, but they didn't do the hard work, right? And it just happened that your project just like, it slid through the door, right? Which means that your next project is gonna be financed, maybe, right? Maybe, because that didn't happen with Ava, but maybe you'll get the crown, you get another crown, you go make another film. But how do we subvert that thing where you're not waiting for them to give you the crown, you just know that I'm an artist, I ain't got no money, all my money goes into my art, so when it's done, it's done. Now I need another bag so I can go make the next piece. Who's going to provide us with the bag? No strings attached, don't have to go to Sundance, don't have to be on the festival circuit, don't have to have good box office numbers, allowed to fail, no return on the investment, just that you are a visionary, I like what you're doing, here goes a check, go make something, right? Because then what that does is, that's not just about the singular person, right? That's about the community that you came up with is now employed again. So now they can go feed their children, or they can go start Harbor Picture Company. You know what I'm saying? Like, this is where we're still waiting on the cats who got the big bag to like give us the crown, set up that whole situation again, then that person gets propelled. And remember, when they get propelled out into that world, you're kind of not bringing your friends with you. They're going to tell you, these are our friends, you go work with them. Because I don't trust that you can maintain the expectation, which is, I need my money back, I need you to do what I tell you to do. You know what I mean? So I just think that for me, in terms of like the existential idea of community building that's beyond my own silo, is like, there's so much talent. I live in Baltimore. It's like, it's crazy. It's crazy, the amount of talent. I can name like 5, 6 cinematographers smashing it. I don't even want, I'm just happy, all right, I just want to watch what y'all are doing, and then I'm going to appropriate what you're doing, and I'm going to go to the next film and do just exactly what you did because it was so interesting, and it may inform my practice differently. But who's going to give them the money? Who's going to give Angel Williams the money to make the next film so that she can then go hire Kirby, and then Herbie can hire, Baltimore got an unemployment issue, Herbie can then go hire his friends in Baltimore to be part of the crew. Like, this is the thing that I think is about the greater community building. You know, not just like, I got the award, I got the prize, I'm the winner now. It's about like, who's working? You know what I'm saying? Who's feeding their kids with this? This is the beautiful part about what we do, is like, we're privileged to make art and be on set with our friends every day, but we also like able to take care of our families and our community. That's incredible. You know what I mean? And that for me is like that investment. Like, who's got it? Who's going to be willing to sign the checks? Like the guy at Morehouse that wrote the $40 million check and excused everybody's student loans. Like,
Yep.
he didn't even blink. He knew it was part of his duty to do that. Where's that philanthropic thing in film? I know some cats that do it, but I'm just saying that like, we need that. That's what we need, you know?
I think, again, to Brad's point as well, something that I appreciate so much about you and our relationship is like, you know, we came together on Pariah, right? And then Ain't Them Body Saints and like, you stick with your people. Like when it came to solo, like I know you had to like fight to bring these people with you. But to your point, you're like it's a collective effort. You know, if you like Bradford Young's work,
right, you gotta
it's
bring
not
these cats.
just the one with the crown.
Right.
It's everyone who helped you get there.
Yeah.
And I mean, no one walks the walk like you. And for every feature that Brad and I work on together, he brings me 3 art installation projects, and like we have just as much fun, if not more fun, collaborating on these things that are getting installed in like a church in Baltimore or in Philadelphia or something, and like those are just as special and in many ways more rewarding than when we're doing like these bigger commercial projects.
And we shouldn't forget that we're all here at Camerimage.
Right.
Yeah,
This is our
exactly.
community.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah,
We come here
100%.
with films or without. We come here to support each other.
Up here.
So, should I wait for the mic? Or
It's okay.
speak up.
Yeah.
I would love for you to touch on the concept of references and originality and the danger of borrowing from films versus paintings, as Matt said, because there sometimes creeps the feeling that looks are becoming prevalent and that there are trends, and so I would love your take on that.
Did everyone hear the question?
Yeah, why don't you repeat it? Yeah, repeat it.
The question was about the problem or the question of references and trends in when you go to a reference, are you using it as a thing, something to copy or something to take inspiration from? Is that another way of saying the same? Okay.
I would address that. Godard says a very good thing. He says, there's nothing wrong with stealing. It's what you do with it.
Yes. Yeah.
So,
I work with Todd and we reference other genres and cinemas and even filmmakers, but it's how you apply that. I saw this brilliant film 2 years ago, The Elephant Still Sitting. And if you look at that film, you could say, oh, that's a reference to Bela Tarr or Milosyansko, or, because it's long extended shots. But he did it in his own interpretation, in his own story that's unique into itself. So there's nothing really original, but it's how you apply what you experience through what's gone before.
I would also say a lot of times people will bring in a reference book and they'll have Post-it notes and literally, like Matt said, pointing out specific details. And that's all fine and good and can be very helpful. But working with Harris Savides, Harris would bring in stacks of books, mostly of paintings, and he'd say, we're not going to talk. We're just going to go through these pages, and we're not going to point at any one specific thing. It's just, let's just calibrate our brains. He actually took me to the Metropolitan Museum one time. We just looked at paintings, and just to calibrate. So it wasn't about copying. It was just more like, hey, I want this movie to feel more like an oil painting than, if we jump straight into building the look without kind of balancing our brain with these paintings, it'd be kind of hard to kind of get to that look. That was a magical experience doing that with Harris. It was a really great approach. To this day, I will sometimes pull out, I have a bunch of photography books and painting books at Harbor. If I've got some downtime, I just pull out the books and just kind of page through and just try to absorb.
That's cool.
More questions?
I think I have more of a technical question. Just about visual, the adaptation that your brain and your eye goes through from when you start the project to when you finish it and you're delivering something. You spend so many times looking at the color, and then how do you reset? How do you do you guys have like specific things that you do? You just kind of like, I need to like walk away for a second, and I just need to like reset for a moment so that we can stay on track on this.
The question is, how do you reset when you've been spending hours and hours looking at these images, and you need to reset your eye and reset your brain?
Couple things really quick is definitely we'll take walks, like just get out of the room. And certainly if you're switching from P3 to now let's look at it on a monitor, or certainly if it's HDR, like you better take a 2 times around the block. If you're switching to HDR, that's like a whole nother headspace. And the other thing is when we work together, like we don't spend too much time sitting on one particular shot or one particular scene. Like it's all about inspiration and reaction right then and there. If Brad's like, hey, let's cool this off, we're like, boom, 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 cool it off, moving on, because we know we're gonna see it again the next day as we come back around.
Right.
I feel like if you sit on one scene for 2 hours and you're pushing different looks into it, I lose it after the first 10 minutes. So Ed will tell you, I'm like, let's just move on. Like, we played with this enough and we'll come back to it. And certainly the look evolves. When we get through the end of the movie and we come back to the beginning, we're like, my God, what were we thinking? And that happens like the first 2 reels, and then the third reel, you're like, oh, okay, like this is, like we definitely come, the look evolves in the DI from day one to the end, definitely.
Well, I'm sorry to say, I think we need to wrap it up. I think they need the room for the next event. But please join me in thanking Harbor and our panelists.